You've just entered the Disaster Tough podcast, the place for emergency managers, first responders, and humanitarians who want to get the job done. Stories, lessons, and tips are provided by field experts. I'm your host, John Scardina, owner of Doberman Emergency Management and former federal emergency response official who's responded to some of the most extreme disasters. Disaster Tough is our mantra. It combines experience, training, and analytics in order to be successful at any stage within the disaster lifecycle. It means being a professional in emergency and disaster services. Doberman Emergency Management lives by this. If your organization needs to fill a gap, please contact us. We can help. Contact info is in the show notes. We also support other products and organizations that will increase your ability. For example, if you fight wildfires, hurricanes, a pandemic, any disaster in the field, at a hospital, or command center, listen up. You're missing out if you do not use L3 Harris for your radio comms. They are secure, portable, mobile, and scalable, which is great news for us in the field. A truly disaster-tough radio system. Check out the XL family of radios by clicking on the show notes or simply go to l3harris.com. When you think of situational awareness, you need to think of Futurity IT. They are disaster tough because they saw a gap and figured out how to close it by creating the Orion and Athena applications. Situational awareness is all about speed, coordination, and accuracy of information. Futurity IT's Orion app collects and provides preliminary damage assessments and integrates all incident action plan documents with WebEOC. The Athena app allows for planning, contact tracing, and customizable group coordination in every single phase of the disaster lifecycle. The best part? Futurity IT made both applications extremely intuitive. It's so easy to use. Click on the show notes today to schedule a free demo.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. It's your host, John Scardina. I'm so excited to be back here. Man, I always talk about data analytics. Of course, I have that data analytics background, and I really try to push that hard, super hard, actually, in emergency management. We've had Caitlin Von Steen on here, Von Stein. She's going to get on me for that. And we've had a couple other people to talk about data analytics from the perspective of GIS or from research and development. But this week, we have a special opportunity to talk about data analytics from the perspective of integrating that with an emergency services and emergency management, so they can use it in real time instead of this GIS unit coming in from the outside. So this is a really special episode because we can talk about that. I'm interviewing Patrick Campion. Oh man, I'm going to screw that up. Campion? Did I get that right?
You got it. That's right.
Sweet. We might have to edit that. We probably won't. So, Patrick's background, Patrick and I talked before, and he has definitely a data analytics background, and he's now running Preparedness Advisors. And so he can talk about that as well. So Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, John. Really excited to be on the podcast today.
Yeah, absolutely. So your background, we kind of got connected through Jason up there at SUNY. Jason's been on the show before. So shout out to Jason. Thanks for introducing us. But you're doing some really cool stuff there in New York. And so let's talk about kind of what you did for the state and then introduce, what you're doing now for your organization.
Sure, sounds good. And yes, Jason Cradaville, thanks for the connection. So shout out to him. I started this company, Preparedness Advisors, LLC, a little over a year ago. But prior to that, I was working for the New York State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. And I was sort of a dual role there. I was a preparedness coordinator, but also a data analyst. I started to see these two worlds merging more and more, where I could take some of my analytics background, which really roots in getting a psychology degree and taking a lot of statistics classes. So taking that analytics training that I had and starting to apply it to emergency preparedness planning, understanding risk and capability gaps, and trying to push the use of data to help our agency be more prepared, get better information to the emergency manager so that they're able to make more timely decisions in an emergency or in the planning stages. And so taking all that, I saw an opportunity to jump out and take some of the programs we worked on in New York and try to offer them, nationwide.
Yeah, that's really cool. So I like the word timely in there, because we were just talking to Eric Helpenstell last week, and his whole career has been responding to like these really catastrophic disasters, both with fire and oil, and really like he's kind of specialized, and I think unintentionally, in oil response. And he had this good quote. In fact, I think we shared it recently, maybe even today. We got shared that he's like, "Time is money, time is response, time is geography. Preparation is everything." And I really liked that. I liked when he said that on the show because I mean, it really comes down to that, right? Life-saving, life-sustaining operations is about time. And so let's talk about that real quick. In terms of time, there's this conflict in emergency management. We've talked about it a couple times on here too, but I'd love to hear your perspective. You get the operator or you get the emergency manager who feels like he has no time, right? She's like, I have no time. And they're kind of true, right? Like, we have no time. You got to act, you got to do something. And I preach that for sure. At the same time, hilariously, you have analytics that says, hey, hold up 10 seconds and I can propel you a lot further. How do you deal with that conflict of go now versus, get ready and wait? I don't know. How do you deal with that in analytics?
Yeah, great question. I think where I started to understand the needs of that emergency manager that's really constrained, that has a juggling a million things at once, has to report to several different people, but needs that information to continue to do a good job. I think where I got an understanding of time was working in an EOC environment. The first one I was really exposed to was Hurricane Sandy several years ago, and just started to understand that I have the ability to collect good information, pull good data together, but if I can't do it in a very short amount of time and provide it in a simplified way for that senior decision maker to use,
Mm-hmm.
then it's useless. And so I just started getting better and better at it and finding little tricks and practical solutions to speed things up and to use tools. And that's what's so great. And I hope we talk about each of these tools a little bit, is that the more you practice in these tools, you find shortcuts and you're able to take a lot of information and consolidate it and present it in a useful way, rather than, I use the term brute force it. Sometimes you see people trying to copy and paste a million rows over and then but it takes too much time to do that. Whereas learning some of these practical tricks and tips can really speed up that process and get the information to the end user quickly.
Yeah, I'm the same way. And so like if I got deployed to Florida, Texas, New Jersey, California, whatever, there are there that are unique. But most of the time it's really just, I would say 90% of the work, if you've done good preparation, you know what data they're looking for, you know what data they need, and you can automate most of those processes. So you're almost pulling it up in real time, if not real time. And you're really only slowed down by the rate of information coming in to be able to update those data sets or to update that information. So yeah, that's like a really good way to start this off, because I could imagine people listening in and say, okay, like you've talked about this a few times now, you're now having the guy who comes on who doesn't do GIS, right? Who does analytics, and I want to do analytics. I'm not going to be a GIS guy. So what are the top 3 things that you would say to them and say, okay, this is where you start. This is what you need to start compiling specifically.
Sure. So in starting things off, I think if you have that initial interest in data analytics, you really want to get some leadership buy-in from the top. Really have someone in your agency that's about it, that's bringing it up in weekly meetings, that's setting it as a strategic goal for your agency to build a data analytics culture, and then start exploring tools that you can use, not just Excel, but tools, visualization tools like Tableau, like Power BI, ArcGIS, all these great tools. Start to see what kind of training and personnel you would need, to build skill in that area. But when it comes to actually understanding what data to collect, I think it really just takes some brainstorming sessions, sitting down and thinking, okay, in a really stressful EOC environment or incident command environment, what is that list of key operational metrics or key damage metrics, if you're talking that term, that you would you would want to know, would want to have ready at your fingertips, and start to list that out, and then come up with some processes for collecting that in an event, either every few hours, at the end of every operational period, and just find a way to pull that information into a centralized document.
I think I think that's great. And probably the way that I would explain it is like the difference between like your map book or like the data analytics that you can get from that versus situational awareness. Like the situational awareness unit, if they're doing it right, that's what a majority of their job is. They are trying to action all the things that incident commander or section chiefs are going to want, people in the field are going to want, and constantly providing those field updates to them. How many people are impacted? At what level? The shelters that are open? How many meals are you providing? Where are they going? The physical locations. So you start to pull in all this information in, and all of a sudden you can start understanding like the scope of your disaster. And without analytics, you really don't know the scope of your disaster, right? You can say like, well, these counties got a declaration, IAPA, whatever. But I mean, that's so wide. I mean, when you look at analytics, that's blown up so much on a map sometimes that you can't really tell. Like, for example, I had somebody complaining about like, oh, you gotta make sure that point on that map is exactly right. I was like, you realize that point is 10 miles wide, right? And so that's why like analytics can come into play, where it's like, stop looking at the visual stuff right now and start looking at like the scope of the disaster. And I think that's really what you're saying. The other thought I had, and we can talk about this a little bit, is training versus response. Response is a great time to be able to get new resources because that's the money there and the awareness is there, and so you can get those resources. Great. But it's like the worst time to prove a new capability. I mean, you can, I guess there's a different way to say that. If you need to stretch the needle and you're trying to do something new and you're trying to be creative to be able to move the needle forward, great. But in terms of like, hey, boss, will you check out this new idea that I had? Like, no.
The right time, yeah.
Right, it's terrible. So training exercises is great way to bring this up with senior leadership. Let's test it out in a training exercise in an environment that you can control, and then show them the validity of it. You're a drone pilot yourself, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Cool. So like that's how I did it with my team. On a training exercise, we had the drone, and I went out there, and the boss's boss was like, it's a toy. And within 10 minutes of like seeing like the information we could collect, he was like, oh, this isn't a toy. Like, well, actually it is a toy, but it's also really helpful. Yeah, so I'm talking too much here as per usual, but yeah, good call out for sure. For sure.
Yeah, and bringing up training, I think that's another aspect where you hopefully an agency can try to improve their use of data analytics is in those more low stress environments when you do have some downtime from the constant operations and can do some training. Try to actually develop and test people's analytic skills. Give them a data set, bunch of raw data, or tell them, hey, pull information from these several resources, pull it together, analyze it, clean it up, and then you have 2 hours. Present this to me at the end of 2 hours, and starts to build that muscle memory of collecting data and finding what those senior decision makers want to see during an operational period. And so hopefully when that actual disaster kind of pops off, it's not the first time you're trying to pull together a team that's performing those skills.
Yeah, and it has real world applications, right? I mean, I bet I could list off a few of myself, but like, let's talk about the real world applications of pulling in data. And we're talking about data from all kinds of sources. We're not just talking about, some people always have these like ideas of like SQL, right? Or like these data mining sources, but it can be as simple as just understanding Excel, right? So what are the applications? What are some of the use cases of data, and what can it do for other people?
Yeah, and great point. I think one thing I try to push and stress is that simple is better sometimes in an emergency management situation, because time is of the essence, and trying to write a lot of code and pull together a lot of complex equations can be really difficult in a high stakes environment. So simple is better. I think use cases, or can you repeat the question again? I guess use cases of
Yeah,
data.
like what are the use cases of like data? Like what can data do for people?
Oh, right. Situational awareness, I think, is just great. Being able to understand a complex situation, kind of condensed down to numbers and hopefully visuals.
Mm.
I think that with all these tools now, being able to take an Excel spreadsheet of data and then visualize that into just a bar chart, just a pie chart, line graph, and then as you progress a little bit more, building pivot tables that can really analyze a lot of information and then upload that to more interactive dashboards. You can view so much kind of information in a short amount of time with those dashboards if they're built the right way, and not only makes that decision maker more aware of what's going on, but there's now an ability to track data over the course of the disaster, and I think that's very important too, especially when it comes to the recovery phase, understanding what costs are going to look like, or doing sort of lessons learned reviews. You have a good trail map or a good trail of information to look back upon.
Yeah, for sure. Like you brought up cost. Cost is huge. One of my like favorite examples of like helping people understand the value of data is not just like the financial, but figuring out what your financials should be. For example, a lot of people haven't heard, if you're not in data analytics, you haven't heard of like R code, like the letter R. In R, you can start to put algorithms together that figures out Q theory. And Q theory for our listeners is essentially saying, like let's look at a bank teller. If I have one person coming in every 10 minutes to see a bank teller, and the bank teller takes 10 minutes to do it, then you have zero Q, right? Comes in for 10 minutes, takes 10 minutes, leaves, and so on and so forth. But we know that that doesn't happen, right? People come in 2 or 3 people at a time. There's lags, all this different kind of stuff. So if you had one person coming in every 10 minutes and the teller took 10 minutes, by the end of an 8-hour workday, the queue would be 5 hours and like 30 minutes. The last person in line would be waiting 5 hours and 30 minutes to be able to go see the teller. And if you added one more person, one more teller, the max queue would be 3 minutes. And so like just understanding like your staffing needs of like, hey, how many people need to be deployed here? Well, let's figure that out. And so like people who get deployment contracts, or, departments who like put together like what they think the playbook should be for a type of incident, data can help them understand. So when that planning section chief goes to his boss and says, I need to bring in 30 people, and, the incident commander says, I think we could do it with 20. Like, well, you're going to get hosed. Or they bring in 30 people and only needed 10. And so data can really start to shape this conversation of like your assets, not just your financial assets, but that those assets and those assets do turn into cost, right? That cost share analysis. So, yeah, great call out there of like just being able to visualize the information through, through analyzing through pivot tables or whatever. Yeah. So let's switch gears here a little bit, and talk about like your experiences, because if we've now framed the conversation of like, okay, we're talking about data, we're talking about it can be used in the field and it can impact a lot of different things. What are some of the most impactful experiences in your career where you're like, this is why data matters?
Yeah, first, I mean, to bring up Hurricane Sandy again, I think that was just a huge event for New York State. So I'm from the Albany, New York area. So, working for the state agency for several years provided me a lot of interesting events to be a part of, and having New York City within your jurisdiction always heightens the risk and the intensity of a situation. So when Hurricane Sandy started to impact the city, time was of the essence. We had to pull in information to get it to our senior leaders very quickly, because that was when they were starting to go on the news to brief the media, or have to brief all the way up to the mayors, the governors of the state. So they wanted to be able to pull together data from the field into 1 to 2 pages of information. And so that was where, and I struggled through that first event, and but I learned.
Oh, we all, yeah,
right, yeah, I learned how to read the situation a bit better, and so I think that would really set me on the path of, hey, I can keep refining this skill. I can keep looking at tools that make me a better analyst in those intense moments, and hopefully when I hand off that product, it's timely, it's useful, and me and my team back in the day, we always took a little pride in seeing maybe one of our reports or some of the bullet points were being read to the media or read to the politicians. The goal, right, was to make
I mattered. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Mattered.
Little victories make our information really useful. Then fast forward, starting to work in preparedness for New York State was just a really great opportunity. What we did there was we actually did a lot of outreach to our county emergency management offices, and we conduct in-person risk and capability assessments with them, where we'd actually go meet with all the key players from the county in the room. So the emergency manager, the public health official, sheriff, fire, and we talked through these assessments where we'd be capturing data points based on the questions that they provided to the answers that provided to our questions. And by doing this assessment across the state in a very standardized, repeatable way, we were able to pull up all this great data that showed state level trends of where our major gaps were, what are our highest risks, and then match that up against grant funding challenges. So what kind of grant funding were these counties getting, and where were their biggest gaps? And if we saw that there was some link between not a lot of grant funding, but a really big gap, I just thought that's a great way to use data. We have the information, we can visualize it, and putting that up on a slide, it tells the story for you sometimes, that rather than you anecdotally explaining the information that you captured. A bar chart can go a long way, save you a lot of breath sometimes.
Yeah, that 10-second answer is a lot better than a 10-page dissertation for sure. So the counties that are, the locations that have a large staff, have a lot of resources, they're scared by that answer, because they're able to get funding and they know that process and they have the staff to do that, and they just plow, right? And what you're saying is, from an auditing standpoint, a standpoint of where to give resources and where to get resources, and to be able to prove that, you just made a lot of counties also really, really happy, right? There are a lot of locations, including states. States do want, nobody wants like a disaster. And those people who are like, there is this train of thought out there. It's like, oh, if a disaster happens, they can show that I'm relevant, and so we're going to do the bare minimum. And if it happens, and like that's like, I like responding. That's stupid, right? It's negligent to a point. So what you're saying is like directing resources to the most vulnerable. And if you're always directing resource to the most vulnerable, essentially your weak places become strongholds, right? And so you have all this additional capability on your end. So that's like, talk about like, I want to say urban warfare, but talk about warfare 101, or like, we do cross that boundary a little bit, right? Like in terms of like, we're at war with this disaster, right? At a hurricane. and we're going to shore up all these different areas. So just interesting to think about it like that. So is that kind of, yeah, go for it. No, go for it.
Yeah, and you made me rethink about some things that I worked on a lot. I think the term grant effectiveness has also been thrown around over the years, and that's something it was always something very hard to answer or to demonstrate. But I think that's part of the business of emergency management, right? Is states and localities get millions and millions of dollars from FEMA each year, and FEMA has a requirement to Congress to show what they're getting out of all that grant funding, and we grappled with it, and it's tough to really demonstrate. But I think tools like local capability assessments and trying to identify gaps and then match that up against the allocation of grant funds is a way to get there. So yeah, but it creates some turf battles between county governments, city governments that are used to getting the same amount of funding each year, or are hoping to get a certain amount of funding each year. But is that the most effective way to use these grant dollars, or could they be distributed in a better way to really be buy down on the risk and those gaps in the most needed counties?
The role of an emergency manager is always to protect life, property, and continuity of operations. And part of that is making the hard call of offending people and saying, you don't have a risk here, like you're fine. And to be able to say, actually, you have a ton of risk. I'm going to help you out. And that political game gets really tough really fast. But the best are doing it. And what you're saying is you're assisting them so that it doesn't come off as an opinion-based analysis. You're saying, like, look, the data is just not backing you up here. And so it's kind of hard to argue with that, right? It's kind of hard to say, like, why are you getting millions of dollars for your dams when you have no dams that are beyond the threshold of being in the danger zone, right? And there is an argument of like, you want to mitigate when the sun is shining, and I get that. But, versus a community that has 500 dams and they're all beyond that 50-year mark, and they're like, well, what do we do? Well, let's give them some cash. So let's talk about then, if I understand that you do analytics and you teach analytics within different states, do you also work with that grant funding process as well?
That's part of the services I try to offer, or the conversations I try to have, is say, hey, we're building these data analytics skills up. We're trying to understand your gaps better, understand your risk better, so that you can spend that money more effectively, or you can make the case to get more money. A lot of times, anecdotes only go so far, but when you collect data in a systematic way and can present it and back it up, you might get that extra $1 million, or you might be elevated to a new funding level of some sort. So yeah, pulling data together and tying it to grants should, I think, always be part of the conversation. I think the two are what we're trying to do is save lives, save property, keep businesses running, but not spend all possible money and drain up our funding in the process. So I think that's really what I try to stress in the conversations I have.
Yeah. So like on the Doberman side, what we do is like, we don't really work with them on the grant management side. We get contacted. In fact, we were just contacted again after they got the grant, right? So we kind of work on that opposite side. Once they get the grant, we go in there, we work with them, and we kind of walk through that process with them of like, okay, what are your requirements? What are your gaps? And I think it's smart, honestly, from your perspective, to say like, hey, I get grants and I get like the allocation of funds, and I can teach analytics, and so you guys can be more efficient. And when you're more efficient, you start hiring Doberman because they're the best. And it becomes like this collaborative atmosphere. Again, I'm all about collaboration and adding the stakeholders. I know you and I've talked about that before of like, there's so many players in this game, and to take your expertise, and your expertise is like teaching and implementing analytics into an organization, and maybe Doberman's is slightly different when we build out plans or we build out these like massive processes for them that allow them to be efficient, and so they're able to get more. One thing that we provide is like that geospatial analysis. And so, like, what I really like to do, it's kind of like on the same end of you as you're thinking. To be honest, it's like, well, let's go in there. Let's provide a hazard vulnerability assessment. It's not a hazard mitigation plan, but we just do that as a complementary service so that people actually know what their gaps are, right? And but that's like a snapshot in time. That's just like us being, generous to the communities that we get contracts with. But I think it's also a wise practice for them to learn how to do it themselves and to be able to keep updating it. And so they're able to direct resources, and they're like saying, okay, like this is a real problem that we have to address, or it's not, and you don't really know what you don't know until you start throwing in the data analytics to do that, right? So.
Yeah, you make a lot of great points there, and always looking to collaborate in the future. But,
we'll connect after for sure.
Yeah, I think both of us have this goal in mind, this kind of probably burning passion to help these agencies solve problems, right? Because we've been in those situations and we've seen how something probably could be resolved a bit better with better data collection or some better, more informed decisions. So I think that's my goal, is to work with agencies and see, hey, what you feel like you're doing certain things effective, but what are those things that are really slowing you down, and how can we apply analysis to improve upon that? Another interesting thing I think that rolls into that in terms of efficiency and producing better plans, better information is trying to shorten emergency planning processes. Just from personal experience, having to write some or having to read a lot of very long emergency management documents out there. It's
the brick.
The brick.
You don't want a brick.
It's this idea of, hey, can we take data and replace a lot of those words with data, right? Can we start to use analysis, and can we make these plans more concise so that we're taking a 200-page plan and dropping it down to 20 pages of writing with an analytic tool to go along with that. And those emergency managers are using that all the time, as opposed to maybe reading it once and then it kind of starts to collect dust on the shelf.
The worst part is when you start seeing plans and they're not written by people who have field experience, and everything's in narrative form. And you're just like having paragraph after paragraph after, it's just like, oh my gosh, like, give me the 5 bullet points. That's what I want. We're going to do counterflow, asterisks. We've never done counterflow before. Okay. That's really good to know. Instead of like this 5-page explanation of like, well, the sheriff's department has a legal authority. It's like, oh my gosh, just like, give me the bullet point. And I think really like what it comes down to is like what, I kind of talked about this the last week or 2 weeks ago with Stephen Johnson and Rodney Melsick. It's like when you really know what you're doing, like that process becomes just as important as the end product. And like that process allows the emergency managers to act and not have to look at their information all the time. But if you're understanding that your process or your processes include a review of like the most current data, like that allows you to send resources. And a good example of that is where people are moving. If your information is from a plan that you haven't updated in a reasonable time, and you're pulling in from the 2010 census data, and you cross now into 2021, which is more than 10 years old, with census data should have come out by now, then your planning expectations are way off. But if your process is to include the most current data of where people are moving and working with city planners and that kind of stuff, when a disaster does happen, you're not sending all these preliminary damage assessment teams off to a community that's rural. You're able to set it to like, the most impacted areas. And so, I don't know, I'm just thinking of like the use cases I've had in my career, and just, I'm like getting twitchy now because I'm thinking about all these experiences. So it's kind of funny. But,
right. And that census data is very important as well. And I think the latest, most accurate data available is so useful for emergency managers, especially the CDC puts out, they kind of group census statistics into social vulnerability data, which I'm sure a lot of listeners are familiar with, but that data can be really useful for planning efforts, maybe not in an immediate response situation because it's probably a little bit dated and there's probably caveats to it, but in terms of just planning your programs and where to do outreach, where to maybe invest in technology across the state, or invest in certain operations that will be really useful in a disaster. I think that data is great to use. So if agencies out there, emergency managers, aren't using that data, maybe that's a recommendation: is, hey, start pulling that out, see what that looks like across your state, see what the vulnerabilities are, elderly populations, populations with disabilities, all these things that could come into play in a disaster, maybe when it comes to evacuations or sheltering. All these vulnerabilities are very useful insights to keep in mind when you're responding.
There are studies done where people who are autistic are drawn to water, and so even if you're like if I was a city planner, or if I was working in my local emergency management office for a city, I'd want to know where the bodies of water are. There's a plan that I worked on, maybe, I don't know, it was a while ago, maybe 8-9 years ago, where the firefighters they had gotten training by like this really excellent training about how to work with people with disabilities, and the law enforcement do is like this joint thing. And after that, after they learned all of that, they were like, we want to know where all the bodies of water are in our city, because if there's a catastrophic event, we want to be able to deploy some volunteer firefighters to be able to maybe help somebody before they drown. And drowning is like a huge problem with people who are autistic. And so it's just understanding like these different nuances that like you don't really think about until you start pulling in like that whole community approach, the social vulnerability index. Another really easy one is tornadoes. You want to know where the tornado is going to go, or you want to know where the flood's going to go, look for the trailer park. It's going to be built in the worst area. They always are. They're cheap land, and so that's where you want to start looking at where your shelters should be. Are your shelters in a floodplain? Are they not? Like you don't want them to be in a floodplain. The worst thing you can have is all these amazing shelters with great schools, 500 miles away from, or 50 miles away from where the disaster is going to hit. How are those people going to get there? And so, like, your planning process again changes so much just by understanding data. That's just like what comes to my mind, just like off the top of my head. But
yeah, and that kind of circles back to the point you made a little bit ago, is that emergency managers are kind of in a war against these incoming disasters, right? Like,
it's kind of an extreme way to say that.
Right.
But it's true. It's true. I want to punch the hurricane in the face. That's my goal.
Like in the most figurative way, like, but to plan for that, you need a good strategy, and thinking through those scenarios, strategizing how to move those chess pieces around either before the event happens or during when the event hits. So yeah, and in terms of that strategy, data can only enhance that, right? Data pulls in so many more bits of useful information. And if you have analysts that can consolidate it and present it the right way, that senior leader that only has so much time to think about, things can quickly, get get an overview and assessment of the current sheltering situation and apply resources more strategically there. So.
Yeah, and strategic. Talk about this. You brought up media before. You don't want to have in some of the media is like harping on you because you put your shelter in a floodplain. Like, hey, did you have to evacuate your shelter? Like,
Right.
and so like there's legal implications. The memorandums of understanding that you have with the people who are doing that, like all this stuff can be driven by data, and like to the point of your organization. The best time to figure that out is during preparedness. The best time to put all that together is preparedness. So, like, I'm going to ask you a little bit about your company, but before I get to that, what I like to ask everybody who comments on the show is if you could change one thing about emergency management, if you could change one thing about emergency management for the future, like that future emergency manager is listening to you right now, what would you want them to do? Don't say analytics. We know that, but like. You know what I mean? Like, what's one super specific thing that you'd want them to do?
I love efficiency. It's something that I've grown up in, and I am drawn to finding kind of the shortest but most effective path to the solution. And I know emergency management has a huge responsibility and a huge kind of mission set, but I think there's so many areas to really trim down some of the fat of the kind of the mission there. And
don't talk about trimming fat. My wife will be like, yeah, it's a good idea. I'm like, shut up.
Oh yeah, it's springtime, so we're all probably working on that. But
yeah,
that's it's finding ways to make things just more efficient. So you can use that money for other good things. Not spending everything on one little mission, but finding a way to spread it out and using. I will bring up analytics, but using analytics to inform those decisions. So
yeah,
that's my big kind of passion, and that's what I hope to push as in conversations going forward. Is hey, how can we make this a great product, but do it in less time and do it with more effective use of money.
Like the scenario, I love what you just said. The scenario that I think of is pulling your headphones out of your pocket. Do you want like that? Like you have to it's all bottled up in a knot, and you have to pulling it apart, and it takes forever. Versus like when headphones are not in a knot, and you're just able to immediately listen to what you want to do. Like that's what I think of when I think of efficiency and emergency management and data. Like if you're basically pulling the headphones out of your pocket with no forethought whatsoever versus taking a little bit of time and wrapping it up before you put it away, how much time do you get to save, and how much time over replicating that thousands and thousands of times for personnel and with all the survivors and everything else, you can save a lot of time. Krispy Kreme, okay, this is kind of really funny. Krispy Kreme, did you see what they came out
donuts.
with? Yeah. Oh, dude, because trimming fat, right? Because that's the worst thing ever. Krispy Kreme came out and they said, we're gonna do, you can have a donut for if you get your vaccination, and they can't track your card every time. It's not it's personal information, so they can say it's limited to once a day. I don't think Krispy Kreme thinks people are going once a day. People are going to go get a free donut every day. Will be some people like that, right? But most people will just if they get their shot, they might go get a free donut. But the weird backlash came out online. Of course, everybody has to harp on everything you do now. But so I saw a post that somebody said if you got a donut a day and looked at the calories and you had no change, ceteris paribus, all things being equal, no change, you'd gain 15.28 pounds a year from doing that. And I was like, who is sitting down and spending their time on figuring out the data of calories versus daily input of Krispy Kreme? But it's a thing, right? And so once you start learning data, you can start kind of having fun with it, right?
Right.
You can figure out. I think it's actually kind of addictive. I really do. once you realize like what it can do for you and how much time and like how many great things it does free you up to do other stuff. You're able to spend 10 more minutes on Instagram, going to Disaster Tough Podcast, liking it, sharing it, commenting on it, which is what everybody should be doing anyways. So yeah, good call out. All right, let's end with this. I want to end with your pitch to states. If you're going to give your pitch to states of saying why hire your company, why do it?
Very good. I love this. I love
we should have led with that.
Spot.
Yeah.
Always
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
My hope, Preparedness Advisors, is to get you to use data to build better strategies, to be more prepared for disasters, so that your agency, your jurisdiction is ready to go on that critical day, and you're not caught flat-footed. There's a path to do it. It's data. It's asking the right questions and improving your decision making. And I just hope to be a part of that and help you out so that when you're in those really stressful moments, you're the calm, cool, and collected one. You've got all the right information at your fingertips, and you've got a culture built around getting the best information possible and using it for the good of the people you're serving.
That's an excellent pitch. Calm, cool, collected when the world is blowing up around you, I think is the name of the game for emergency managers. Stress matters. You have to be able to make decisions, and you have to be able to make decisions on the best information possible. And I think that's an awesome pitch. And I totally support you. And I hope you come back on the show, Patrick. And, we talk more about this, especially as you roll this company out more and you're able to say, like, here are the use cases in these different states that are starting to apply that. And I think you're going to have a lot of great experiences because of that. So thanks again for coming on the show and for talking to me and sharing your experience for sure. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for having me. And look forward to future conversations.
Absolutely. All right. And, if you are listening to Patrick's episode and you want to get a hold of him, what we're going to do is we're going to put his company's website in our show notes. And so you can contact him directly. It's Preparedness Advisors, as Seed mentioned. Really smart stuff. If you really want to improve your processes and be more efficient, as we talked about, be more timely, look better to the media, look better to your bosses, you want data and you want to implement it in the best way possible. So it's excellent that that Patrick is on the show talking about that. If you appreciated his value, which you should give us a 5-star rating and subscribe to our podcast. Of course, you can check out more about Patrick on our main page on Instagram, Disaster Tough Podcast. We also post on Facebook and LinkedIn. So check us out there. We're gonna have a video segments of this. So we have lots of different ways to contact us. You can do that through our through our social media pages, of course. But we also have lots of people who reach out to us at info@dobermanemg.com. Please keep doing that. We love hearing your comments. If you have additional questions for Patrick, I keep on getting the emails. Like I said, I love the emails, but we would like to be able to see the whole community approach here. So if you have a question for him, put it out on social media. Let Patrick answer it directly, and we'll see you back next week. Thanks.